when did you write it? How long did you take to write it? And it's like, it's always kind of a weird question because it's like, well, how long does it take to write a piece of software? Like, how long did it take any piece of software to be written? Well, it kind of depends on what version you're talking about. And so, when I first wrote Cracking the Coding Interview, I actually did not intend for it to be a book. That was never my intention. It was like, this is a little, trying to monetize this website that's wasting my time, and tried a few different things. And I was like, let me try writing a, little short 20-page guide. And I remember on day one being like, oh, that's what it looks like when you actually have something that's resonating. And then it took actually quite a few years for me to realize that of iterating, improving, extending, to realize that what I kind of accidentally did was stumbled into writing this book that, soon eventually got to be really, really popular, which has been a pretty amazing experience.
Is it public, Gayle, how many copies of the book have been sold?
It's not, and honestly, I would have trouble telling you that information because there's so many different translations and etc. So I don't know really.
I'm curious, were you surprised by the success of the book? Like, I mean, was it immediately obvious to you in 2008 when you published that this is going to be a banger and it's going to like get, at least I would imagine hundreds of thousands of copies sold? Like, what was your reaction to the data as it came out?
I think it's sort of like the myth that saying that's actually a myth, but that like, a frog in boiling water doesn't something notice that it's right. So I think these things happen. They don't happen overnight. They happen through a long progress. And so, no, because there isn't a moment, there isn't a thing. And honestly, it took, because I see myself so much as an engineer and actually not as a writer, like it's, when people label my job as being a writer, I'm like, I guess it's kind of weird to me. Because that's not what I never set out to say, I want to go be an author. I want to go write a book. It was, I have a website and monetizing off ads clearly isn't working well. And then I think it took, I think I came out with the first physical version in 2011. That was when it first started getting sold on Amazon. And then the, sixth edition, the most recent edition, came out in 2015. So it's such a long process that there was never a moment where I was like, oh, wow. There's been a few things over the years where it's like, I remember the first time I was like recognized in public. That was like, that's weird.
Yeah.
So there's been a few moments like that, but it wasn't, nothing is, almost nothing really is a true overnight success, right? It's always a long process.
And for those people who are not aware, could you briefly share your background before you started writing the book and what led you, like what was the inspiration to start putting your writing together?
Yeah. So my background is originally as an engineer. So, computer science undergrad, master's, and then worked a little bit at Microsoft and Apple, and then went to Google full time. And pretty much immediately got roped into doing interviews, in part because they were growing rapidly and needed that, in part because, frankly, because being a woman, they just rope you in. They rope you in for DI reasons. And so it's on the hiring committee. But so that's like one piece of it. And then the other piece, there's all these like, writing this book was really a confluence of a bunch of different aspects of my life. There's, being an engineer, but there's also this other big aspect of my life where I actually really enjoy teaching. When I was in college, I started my own classes and actually got the opportunity to teach my own classes, and something I really enjoy, actually, the process of explaining a process, of breaking down concepts to people. And so in a lot of ways, it's like, it's not that I love writing. I love coding and I love teaching.
The website you mentioned where you had a bunch of writing, is that Career Cup?
Yeah. That was a forum for interview questions.
What happened? I actually remember when I was at Stanford, I was in college, I bought your book, and then I actually recall, like, okay, let me look up the author. And I think I stumbled upon Career Cup. I have not stumbled across it recently. What happened to that forum, that website?
I shut it down basically a year, 6 to 12 months ago. It was never something I super invested in at a technical level. And so, yeah, it just wasn't worth the cost maintaining.
Okay. One of the things that we chatted about is after you wrote the book, you had a lot of inbound interest actually from companies to kind of get your expertise on how should they design interview process. I'm curious if you could share maybe one or two insights from what you learned. Because I mean, you had obviously some experience, but like when you started consulting with these bigger companies, what did you learn that was maybe unexpected?
Um, yeah, so I do. So, my sort of work now is, yes, I have the books, and then I also do consulting with actually two forms of consulting. One is acquisition. So when companies go through acquihires, they will sometimes bring me in to help prepare their people for interviews. And the other sort of bigger part is actually teaching companies, constructing hiring processes, teaching companies how to interview. And I think one of the things that surprised me is I think I sort of assumed at some point that like the big companies, surely they have training, and then they're bringing me in. I'm like, no, they actually did not have training. And these are some of the really, really big household names actually have not had training. Um, and and I think one of the things that is really difficult is that a lot of companies are uncomfortable coming out and saying what these interviews are all about. So they talk a lot about like, oh, computer science fundamentals and this and that. It's like, look, like I actually think there would be less controversy in a lot of ways about, there's always going to be controversy about any type of interviewing. All of interviewing of any type has problems and flaws. But I think one of the things that makes people really struggle with why we're doing this process is they don't understand why we're doing this. That the core reason why we are asking these questions is that this is effectively a form of an intelligence test. It's not a literal IQ test because, one, it's not a literal IQ test conducted by a psychologist, but it is evaluating a very particular type of intelligence that people believe is relevant to software engineering. And I think if people kind of say, this is what it is, and you can debate, does it work that effectively or not, and what are the problems with it? But like, that is what we're doing here. And that is why when people say, well, but if, in the real world, I would just use this API that would solve the problem. So why can't I do that in an interview? And if you understand that these are supposed to be effectively intelligence tests, then it kind of makes a lot more sense. Why can't you just use this one line API to solve the problem? Because it's not about solving the problem. It's about actually evaluating your thought process. And one of the issues at companies is a lot of companies actually haven't told their interviewers that. Some interviewers kind of figured it out, but some interviewers haven't figured it out and they don't get it. And then they start judging people on the wrong aspects. And so there are a lot of, it's not that this process is flawless. It's certainly not. I feel like nothing makes it clearer. The flaws in the process become so incredibly clear when you're working in this industry, when you're helping people prepare. The process has a lot of flaws, but probably one of the biggest issues is interviewers and candidates, frankly, who don't understand that at its core, this is what the process is supposed to be about.
That makes a lot of sense. I have one more question, and maybe after that we can transition into the sequel that the four of you wrote. But one of the things I get asked about a lot is the interview process is way more difficult now, or it feels that way compared to 5 or 10 years ago. And I think I'm wondering your commentary, because on one hand, there are way more software engineers in the world compared to 2008 when you initially kind of got into this. At the same time, there's also way more awareness, in large part because of your book or other websites. So I'm curious if you feel like that's if that sentiment is like reflected in the data of like these companies are generally increasing the difficulty of the kind of gatekeeping, or the admission price to getting into the companies is getting higher and higher.
I think it's true, and I think there's a lot of nuance there. So there is a anecdote or a story about we actually reference in Beyond Cracking the Coding interview that you may have heard as kids of like you're out, two people are out walking in the woods and they see a bear. One friend takes off running, the other one fixes his tennis shoes. And the friend says, "Why are you fixing your sneakers? You can't outrun a bear." And he says, "I don't have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun you."
Mhm.
And it gets at like, look, with these interviews are about our intelligence test, but that's not an absolute metric. It's not well, if you solve X thing after Y amount of time, then this is good and bad. It becomes this. It is effectively like you're being graded on a curve. You're being compared to other candidates that interviewer has interviewed.
Mm.
And so what that means is that as more people are preparing, everybody is doing better. And that's going to inevitably mean that the bar is going to creep a little bit higher because everyone's doing better. So in that sense, yes, the interview process has gotten harder, and it's kind of inevitable. However, it's also, I think, more of the bad stuff has been taken out of the process. So as there's been more education for candidates about how to do well in interviews, there's also been more education for interviewers about what we're doing and why we're doing this and what's working well and what's not. And so some of the stuff, when I graduated from college, it was still kind of common for companies to be doing things like, well, you have 8 balls and one ball is heavier than the other, and these brain teasers. And there's a lot less of that stuff now. And so, yes, processes have gotten harder. But we've also had a lot of the kind of crappy stuff taken out of the process. We've had more, and this is actually going to sound strange, but it's actually a good thing for candidates. We've actually had more of the easy questions taken out as well. And the reason why I say that's a good thing is that easy questions create randomness in the process. It makes it, when you have to outperform other people on an easy test, it starts becoming a bit arbitrary. You make one stupid mistake, and now all of a sudden you're in the bottom half. And so having the easy questions taken out is actually a good thing in a lot of ways.
Hmm. And that's actually a good segue into, as we talk about the changes and how this whole kind of cottage industry of tech interview preparation has evolved. Why don't we start with Gayle, and then we'll bring in all the other authors. But Gayle, I'm curious if you could talk about what was the reasoning behind having a sequel, right? So broadly, this book coming out tomorrow, there's 13 new topics. That's a much more enhanced, deeper version compared to the initial book. And as Aline told me, it covers a lot more squishy topics. So I'm curious to hear about what that means. But yeah, Gayle, why don't we start with you? Curious about how the idea came to be and why you felt there was a need to do a Beyond CtCI book.
Yeah. So by the way, I have to say, I love that like Aline has slowly like accepted my term squishy. At first it was like, I don't know. But it's slowly gotten used to it, I think.
Nice.
So, I don't know if you remember this when you were in college, but sorry, I suppose I shouldn't make that assumption if you went to college. But when I was in college, I remember this like frustration when professors would come out with new editions of their books as basically a way of just making people buy new things. And it always bothered me. And so people have, I have come out with several new editions of Cracking the Coding interview over the years, and each one has been a really, really meaningful improvement. It's been still fundamentally the same style of book, but it's been a pretty substantial improvement over the past edition. And with this 6th edition, it's not that things couldn't be better, but I was kind of always like, well, should I come out with a new edition? What would I do if I would have come out with a new edition? And I didn't come out with 7th edition yet because I didn't have a great answer to how would I make this really meaningfully better. And I think or at least do something substantially different. And I think with Beyond CtCI, the reason why it's not a new edition and it's actually a new book is because it is actually, and I think as soon as if you've seen Cracking the Coding interview and you look at Beyond Cracking the Coding interview, they are substantially different books, not not just in terms of the topics covered, but the way that it's covered. So Cracking the Coding interview is it has some stuff about here's how to tackle questions. Here's a bit of stuff on resumes and some other things. And then let's take a bunch of interview questions and let's walk you through how to do it. It's not, here's a question, here's the optimal answer, now let's go on to the next question. It's actually kind of walking you through how to do it. Beyond CtCI is written in a significantly different way. It focuses, it's almost like it takes if you think about CtCI, it had a whole bunch of introductory stuff on how to tackle questions, talking about the BUD framework and things like this. CtCI is sort of like a really deep dive on those topics, and then expanding it also to a bunch of other things. And so talking about, here are some specific like recipes that to help you tackle, sliding windows problems, graph problems, etc. It's not here's an interview question, let's walk you through how to do it. It's here's concepts and let's walk you through a bunch of different ways of how to tackle it. And so it's written in a very different style. And then also brings in, because we have Aline here, we're able to get a lot of awesome data from interviewing.io about interview questions and candidates, and bring in a bunch of replays so you can actually listen to how different candidates are interviewing, which is a pretty cool thing to experience.
Yeah, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and let's bring in the co-authors. And what I thought might be helpful is for the three of you, in the order that I see on my screen, Aline, then Nil, then Mike, why don't we go one by one and maybe just give a quick intro, who you are, your background. And then I thought it could be interesting. You guys are the experts here, right? So maybe share one tip or insight for 2025 job seekers about interviewing, like what you think has changed, or one thing that you found maybe surprising in the process of writing this book. So Aline, go ahead.
All right. Hey, everybody. My name's Aline. I'm the founder and CEO of Interviewing.io. I saw some familiar faces here, so thanks to the IAO folks who could make it. I am an engineer by trade, although I have not been one professionally for a long time. I've been running Interviewing.io for about 9 years and doing a lot of Foundry stuff, like sending emails and most recently helping write a book. I also, before I started Interviewing.io and after I was an engineer, worked as a recruiter for a few years. So I ran recruiting at 2 companies, TrialPay, which you probably haven't heard of, and Udacity, which you probably have. And then I started my own recruiting business where I was helping a bunch of companies that were startups then, but many of which are public big names now, hire engineers. So I've been on all sides of the table, both in-house recruiter, agency recruiter, engineering manager, IC engineer, interviewee. One thing, and Interviewing.io, I should just quickly, for those of you who haven't heard of it, we do anonymous mock interviews. So we've been around for a long time. For this book, we drew on Interviewing.io's data set, as Gayle mentioned, and we had a lot of folks in our community graciously let us use their interview replays in the book. And if you actually read the book, you'll be able to listen to people making the same kinds of mistakes that we talk about. One thing that I see is important for interviewing. I'll talk about the biggest mistake that I think Interviewing.io users make, and probably by extension, the biggest mistake interviewees make. Most people don't know that if you're feeling unprepared for an interview, that you can actually tell your recruiter that you want to postpone. I know that sounds silly, but tactically, this is really the biggest mistake that I see people make. Often, a recruiter will reach out to you, and let's say you've been trying to get into a FANG company for a long time, and all of a sudden you have a message from a Google recruiter being like, hey, come and interview. A lot of people assume that there's a ticking clock on that, and this is their one shot, like, an 8 mile. And if you get that recruiter message, you have to interview. The reality is that when you got that message is a product of an uncertain and chaotic universe, and it doesn't really matter, right? Recruiters are always going to be trying to recruit. And with the exception of what we saw in 2022, where the big companies froze hiring, that happened like once, right? For the most part, these large companies have evergreen roles. So if a recruiter pings you, you can always have the recruiter call, figure out what's what, tell them you're interested, and then just say very honestly, you know, I'm taking this opportunity really seriously. I want to put my best foot forward. How about I take some time to prepare and then we'll schedule? And your recruiter wants you to succeed because they look good when you look good. So they will very likely say yes. They might try to pressure you a little bit. And by the way, you can do this at the onsite as well. So let's say you had a technical phone screen, it went well, but you haven't prepared system design or behavioral yet. You can say, hey, you know what? Great. I'm going to need some time to prepare. Let's pause. And then you can also use this to line up all your interviews. So you do your onsites around the same time and hopefully get your offers in at the same time. That was a long answer. I'm going to kick it over to who's next? Nil, I think.
Yes, Nil would be
Okay.
good. That was a great answer, Aline, by the way. I love that advice.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nil. So the thing about me is I'm the guy who really likes the lead code grind. So I've been really passionate about algorithms for a long time. That brought me to doing a PhD in algorithms and data structures, which was a lot of fun to me. And then after that, I was in interview prep teaching algorithms for a bit. That's where I met Mike. After that, I was at Google for a bit. I thought I should try industry a little bit. And then I quit recently to write this book. Yeah, so I hope people will get the book to like try to get a job, but will come out of it liking algorithms a bit more. Like that's my personal goal with it. Regarding interviews in 2025, I'm not on either side of the table right now, but what I hear on the recruiter side is that right now sorting through online applications is like absolute hell. So one of the consequences of AI is like people are like automating part of the process, like writing a cover letters, things like that. And they are just getting bombarded with up to thousands of applications. And so recruiters, I think, are basically trying to stay away from that. And what that shows to me is that networking weighs a lot more now than it used to a few years ago. So for example, I have an acquaintance who is a founder startup. He told me if they see a resume, it doesn't have like a big university name and exact technologies in the position, they just throw it away immediately. But that same person like will consider me for the job, even though I don't have either of those. So that kind of shows you how low trust is right now when it comes to like getting random jobs. So my advice will be, if there's some technology that you're interested about, there's some niche that you're passionate about, try to find the community around that topic where people communicate and help each other about that stuff and try to be part of it. And that's not only because it will get you a job, which maybe doesn't directly translate to that, but because looking for a job, honestly, is like a very isolating experience. And so you can counterbalance that a bit by at least like having some form of human interaction there. So let me give you a couple of quick examples of this. So for example, when I was a teaching assistant during my PhD, I worked with hundreds of students, right? Who I think all of them will be happy to give me like a referral because they've seen me like solve algorithm problems in front of them like many times. But back then I wasn't thinking about networking at all. So I didn't even have a LinkedIn. So don't be like me, right? Like apply that to your situation. And the other is I recently met the engineering team at Interviewing.io. And that was like a bunch of engineers, and they all came from being interviewers in Interviewing.io. So Aline didn't sort through a pile of random applications. She like pulled from their network.
I have no idea where anybody that works for me went to school. No clue.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, so over to Mike.
Yeah.
Yeah, hey everybody. I'll keep this fairly quick. I know we've been going for a while, but my name is Mike. Mroczka is the last name. That's Polish. If you never pronounced that correctly, that's fine. I'm not easily offended. So I work previously as a senior software engineer. I worked at Google. I've worked at Salesforce. I've got about a decade of experience. And I transitioned to work on the book early last year, January, and yeah, I've been working on it full time ever since. We're excited to get this out to you, and the technical stuff has been the main stuff that I've been writing with Nil, of course. And yeah, I think the only other things about me are that I'm a technical coach at Interviewing IO, and I've done kind of work within the space of technical coaching for the last 5 years. So I know, practically speaking, what works for people, as well as the sort of academic theory that we like to kind of put together as well. And yeah, the specialty that I end up having is teaching people how to get unstuck in interviews. A lot of people don't realize that there's a formula, a set of processes we can take in order to get yourself unstuck in interviews. And that's kind of what we teach in Beyond Cracking the Coding Interview. And I'm excited to share it with you all at some point. But as far as the question goes, the high level of like what kind of makes a difference and what moves the needle in the job market today, I think I would say that questions, you mentioned, like, are they getting harder? And there is some truth to that being harder. We have data at Interviewing IO that it's about 15% harder, or approximately. And there's some interesting ways that we kind of crunch those numbers. But hard is also a relative term. When a lot of people think it's harder, they think, oh no, it's because dynamic programming and I need to learn dynamic programming. And everyone's freaking out about dynamic programming. And the reality is that, like, yeah, okay, maybe if you've got some time to study dynamic programming, that's great. But like, if you don't know what a sliding window is, or if you're not really good at the heap time complexities and things like that, there's a ton of order that comes with this. And a lot of these things are difficult, not because they're truly hard, but just because of exactly Brandon, who says in the chat, how do you measure hardness? Like, exactly that. It's like, it's not hard because it's actually hard. It's hard because, like, you went to one of the most difficult topics that required the most prerequisites possible. And it's like, if you're not good at recursion, you're not going to be good at or backtracking, you're not going to be good at dynamic programming. So I think a lot of people just study the order wrong. And that's kind of what we provide for you in the book, is like an order, a series of steps where the logical progression makes sense. Each chapter connects with the next thing, and ideas connect in a way that kind of make it make sense. You're not just randomly jumping to, like, I'm good at everything but DP, for instance. So yeah, that's hopefully a fairly concise answer, and back to you, Rahul.
Amazing. That was great. I think, Gayle, I get the terminology from you about squishy topics. So maybe Gayle or Aline, could you talk about what are those squishy topics, and why do you feel the need to include that in the book now? Because that seems like all brand new stuff relative to what was there initially.
Yeah, I'll tackle this briefly, and then I'll turn it over to Aline. So, you know, it was in Crack the Coding Interview. It wasn't when some things have materially changed there. But it's also, you know, I think one of the big things is that there are more engineers out in the world now. There is more access, and there's, you know, the job market is changing. And so one of the things that's shifted a lot is it is harder now to get your resume noticed. You know, applying online was never a great way to go. But now it's, you know, especially bad. Going through the established networks. And so there's a lot more need nowadays to figure out, okay, how do you actually get somebody to look at your resume? How do you actually, you know, what does matter to your resume? How do you get someone to actually look at it? And so there's a lot more need for that stuff now. Because I think everything has gotten, I think people overplay it. I don't think it's 3 times as hard as it was. At least, you know, not across the board, but there are certain things that have gotten a lot harder. And so there's a lot more need to really expand on that. Aline, I'll turn it over to you for a bit more information.
Yeah, I think so when we say squishy stuff, we mean everything from how to get in the door at companies to how to control the timing of your job search so all your offers come in at the same time, to negotiation. And I think we'd honestly be doing people a disservice if we didn't include those things. People often talk about how they're having a hard time with a job search. And I think Gayle and I, the first question we'd ask is, Are you having a hard time getting in the door? Or are you having a hard time passing interviews? And they're really two sides of the same coin. And very rarely are people great at one and then terrible at the other. Most of the time, people have a hard time with both. So if we're really going to talk about job searches holistically, we have to include these things. I think one of the common themes of this book, and this applies for both the technical sections and the squishy sections, is this idea of teaching people how to think and how to reason about what's going on and helping them understand why things are the way they are. And that goes for the squishy sections as well, right? We'll talk about what recruiters are thinking, how hiring got to be the way it is, why reaching out to recruiters, I mentioned this in the chat earlier, is not as effective as reaching out to hiring managers. Because once you can have a model in your head of how job searches work end to end, you're going to be much more successful. And then, of course, we get very tactical with exactly what to say. With interviewing IO users, and I think in general with most things in life, advice is easy to give. But the advice that people really need isn't just what to do. It's like, what do I actually say? Yeah, great. You're telling me to negotiate. What the fuck do I say? And that's a lot of what this book is.
Yeah, what I tell people all the time is that there are two very distinct phases of the job search. Phase one is get the interview. Phase two is pass the interview. Exactly what you said, Aline. And I think people often will prematurely jump to phase two and just like blindly start grinding leak code when they haven't done phase one yet to line up the interview. And it's a complete waste of time, right? So I love that advice. I want to go back, Mike, to one thing you said, which is like, you said something along the lines of there's a deterministic process to get unstuck in an interview. That sounds pretty compelling. I like the sound of that. And I'm sure you go into detail in the book, but can you give us the high level? What is the TLDR on getting yourself unstuck when you encounter a problem in the interview?
Sure. Yeah. What I'd say is this is something that, yeah, both Nil and I are pretty passionate about. So yeah, definitely I'll let him chime in too. But I think the high level steps are sort of kind of the three major steps. So for one, for any question, we need to immediately try and bound a problem in terms of Big O. We talk about the importance of Big O, and it becomes a foundation of everything we do throughout the entire book. But for any question, we can say, okay, so what is, if I was just not to care at all, what's the maximum that I could do? And then like, if I was to get, what is my theoretical like best time complexity? Like what's the best upper and lower bound that I think I can hit? Bounding the problem immediately eliminates a lot of things. I mean, if we know that the boundary is logarithmic, for instance, we know that there's tons of topics we don't actually have to even consider in our arsenal of tools. And that really kind of helped us narrow things down. Another thing these days that tends to be helpful is triggers, which is sort of the next kind of major thing to discuss. And triggers are things about the problem itself that make it obvious that a specific tool needs to be used. If an array is sorted, it's a really strong trigger for two-pointer questions and for binary search, as an example. And then the third and kind of final sort of door that we open for teaching people to get unstuck is actually a series of techniques that we like to call boosters, because they're problem-solving boosters to help us get unstuck. And that involves everything from sort of drawing, making connections between properties in the problem itself, and we kind of walk through different ways to do that, as well as things like cycling through, like what are the things I know about this problem already, and what are the tools that I have, and which ones kind of match based on the boundaries, to even sort of intelligently being able to let your interviewer know that you're stuck and be able to get as much information as you can without directly asking for a hint. So there's lots of different kind of tools that we can kind of employ, but that's the high level framework. There's sort of this boundary thinking, triggers, and then boosters. And Nil, any want to tack on anything to that, or you feel I covered? Okay.
Yeah,
great.
I think that's it. Like if there are questions, we can go into detail.
Absolutely, sure.
I have one more question, and then I'm thinking we can spend a bit of time just from the audience Q&A. But one question just for anyone is, there's so much to learn when it comes to the interview prep, right? When you just think about the technical side of it, there's a couple of things that come to mind. Binary search, trees, graphs, backtracking, dynamic programming. And so a common question I get, or anxiety that I feel from people, is that it's overwhelming. I'm wondering if you all have advice on how, if I'm a candidate, I have an interview, let's say at, I don't know, Oracle or Microsoft, how can I orient, how can I calibrate where I am, and then figure out what are the things that I should really focus on for these set of target companies that I am actually going for. I'm curious if you all have thoughts on that.
I mean, I'll dive in. And see if Mike wants to add on something, or Nil. But one thing I just want to call out here is I think there's this idea that you need to have a ton of knowledge to do this stuff, and people start learning Dijkstra's algorithm and all of this stuff, and it's like, look, this people are not a lot of interviewers are going around asking Dijkstra's algorithm because, among other things, like they don't know it either. The reason when people do poorly in interviews, it's usually not because they didn't know something about linked lists or they didn't know something about binary trees. It's not that that doesn't happen, but like that's not usually the barrier. There are a segment of people, namely people without CS degrees, who may not have that knowledge. And yes, you need to not know that knowledge and you need to know it well, but it's not you need to have a ton of knowledge. It's you need to have a core set of knowledge that is not that big, but you need to really have that down pat. It needs to be easy for you to, write code to insert a node into binary search tree. That should be an easy problem for you to do. You need to have that knowledge down really, really well. And then you need to get really good at applying that knowledge. It's not that you need to have a ton of actual data structure knowledge. That basic set of knowledge you need to have really well, down really well, and then you need to get really good at applying that to some more challenging questions.
Yeah, just want to I think I echo everything that Gayle says. She's spot on there. The only other thing that really I'd want to point out is we actually break up topics in the book, and there's tier 1 topics, there's tier 2
Show
topics.
the image. I pulled it up while you guys.
Oh, do you have? Oh, yeah.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. Show your screen if you can. Yeah, so we actually break this up because it's so important that you don't go start learning like low tier 3 level topics before you've gotten the fundamentals in place. And this, again, like I said, is one of the biggest mistakes people make. Somebody asked in the chat, basically, what's the order of topics? And we go into a lot more detail, but kind of this, like if you don't know everything in tier 1, like you really shouldn't probably be going on to tier 2. And tier 3, we say, is totally optional. Like advanced dynamic programming questions, that's probably not a good use of your time unless like very specifically that question is going to get asked. And like, how could you, So yeah, I think I just would, again, just kind of echo that more than anything, knowing like an order of topics and sort of following just what comes up most frequently and not going after, like Gayle mentioned, Dijkstra's algorithm or union find when that's just honestly not the most important thing. So yeah, anyone else want to chime in here?
That's great. Okay, so here's what we'll do now. If you want to ask a question, I want to prioritize people who are willing to unmute and I feel like it brings a bit more dynamism to the call. So raise your hand in Zoom. I'll ask to unmute you. We'll probably have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions. Before we do that, I'm going to just do a CTA. So the biggest CTA obviously is for people, if you're interested in the book. I dropped the link on Amazon. It as per what I see, it says #1 new release in internet and social media. So off to a good start. And I'm sure the content, I haven't read it, but I'm sure it's going to be a great book. So feel free to check that out. And then for the 4 of you, the authors, are there particular profiles or things you want people to follow you on? I'd love for you to drop that in the chat or just share now before we go into questions. Yeah, earlier on, I dropped the LinkedIn for the 4 of you, but if there's anything else, like Aline, obviously interviewing IO, feel free to drop that in the chat. Okay. Brandon is asking, how do I raise my hand? LOL. So I think if you go into React, go into React and there's a button called raise hand. All right, so while you figure that out, Brandon, hopefully you figured it out, let's go with Omri as the first person I see. So you should be able to unmute now.
Hey, so thanks. This has been a really great presentation. It's cool to hear from everybody. One thing I'm interested about, and I think maybe this is something that's kind of different about me and maybe Taro users, just from what I've seen, but probably not entirely. With where I'm at, as I'm gonna restart the job search soon-ish after not searching for a while. I know that I don't care to work for any FANG or any big tech companies. I also know that I don't care to be in the Bay Area or in Seattle and work for like a high-paying startup. I'm more so interested in working for, you know, a stable, not whatever, but a stable, decent technology company that's where there isn't like a line of a billion people like going through the door get trying to get hired and interview over there. The question is, right? So I know that CtCI is going to be useful for, you know, the technical knowledge and the behavioral knowledge and everything, no matter where I go. But for people that don't care so much to interview for big tech, for FANG, for you know, very competitive startups, what can they expect, and how is the game different from what people are able to tell me?
Yeah, anyone can take it. Feel free to. Yeah, Mike, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So, for one, thanks for the question. Yeah. So I think it's a myth. Like, not everybody needs or even wants to work at a FANG company. What I would say is that the myth is that I think it's actually sometimes easier to get into a FANG company than it is to get in another company, and that just comes down to consistency of process. You know, if you wanted to work, let's say, as a software engineer at Walmart or Home Depot, those have virtually like not even close to the same processes for hiring people. They ask different questions, the process, like very, very different things. Fortunately, the more senior you get, the more likely you'll be asked some amount of system design, and then it's maybe a little bit more standardized. But in general, for a coding question, you could be asked to build a CRUD app on the spot. You could be asked to do log into a code base and do a code review. You could be asked to find a bug in a set of tests. Or maybe if you're a front-end developer, you could be asked to like build a progress bar in front of them, or design tic-tac-toe if you're a back-end developer. There's lots of different things that you could be asked. So giving a specific idea as to exactly what to expect is hard at these sort of other tech company, sort of like maybe not direct tech companies. What I would say though is that no matter where you want to go, there is always a pretty good chance that you could get at least one round of data structures and algorithms. I went to Salesforce. I was at General Electric before that, and both of those had leak code questions. So I would say that even if that isn't like the only focus, and even if you don't necessarily care about just getting into a big tech company, it's definitely something that's just incredibly important as a software engineer. Big O analysis especially is the language of software engineers. And it's how we talk and it's how we communicate as to what is good code and what isn't. So it ends up being really important regardless of where you want to work. Hopefully that helps a little bit. I'm happy to hear other people's thoughts.
One thing I'll add quickly is because there's so much variance in like a lot of smaller companies take their cues from FANG, I would say misguidedly. But they're like, oh, if Google hires good people, let's just do what Google do. That doesn't always work. Some companies realize that and they don't do Google-like things. The best thing that you should do, and this goes for everybody, no matter what company you're interviewing at, is not be afraid to ask questions. People often assume that their recruiter is constantly judging them for everything that they do. That is generally not true, right? You should view your recruiter as a resource. They may not know all the answers. There are many bad recruiters out there that don't know anything. Many don't know what their company even does. But chances are they have some visibility into what the process is. And the more specific your questions are, the better answers you're going to get. So just ask all the questions that you want liberally.
Erin, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Erin. Many people know me as the author of Creating AR VR. So shout outs to all 4 co-authors. It is a lot to write a technical book. And I just want to say to Gayle personally, I see a lot of negative comments about you and your book, and that is totally unfair because people have very high expectations that is completely unwarranted. And I know what that's like to deal with the comments, even if you're top rated on Amazon, like myself. 2 questions I have. Does this book cover AI and ML at all? I saw a lot of the chat talking about it, and I'll paste this question again, which I know wasn't answered earlier. A lot of my friends in my experience, whether they're data scientists or machine learning engineers, data analysts, they're like, this is way back when, this is pre-chat GPT era. They're like, the hardest question I had is linear regression. They don't ask DSA. And I know a lot of your first book talks about like the fundamentals of just regular backend engineering. And I find when I'm talking to other members of Taro, they're like staff MLs being like, we're not going to ask you that. Our weighted is, hi, we're going to talk to you about, training models and the stuff that I like to talk about more in terms of like computer vision with AR, VR. So that's the first question, particular to AI machine learning. And then 2 is, how common is it to whiteboard hard questions like tier 3 on the first interview and on-site after COVID at any Feng Mula or big tech company or like an OpenAI type of startup?
Yeah, so your first question, so we talked about what to include, obviously, in the beginning of kind of designing the book. And we made a call, which I think is the right one, of system design, ML topics for the people who are applying to that. Those are incredibly important topics. And putting in a cursory chapter is not really helping anybody at this point. And so we made a call to focus specifically on coding, the coding algorithm style questions, and and then also provide some content on behavioral interviews, specifically as it relates to engineering roles. And sort of dive in and focus on those and say, yes, please do. If you do need to do system design also, we're not going to cover it here, but you should go and prepare that stuff too, because it's really important. Your second question I just lost track of.
About how likely is it for tier 3 topics to show up in especially the competitive startups and tech companies?
So my answer to that would be, the reason they're in tier 3 is that they aren't super common, but also they can happen. And so whether or not you want to prepare for them is really your choice. We're kind of saying, look, like, you can, if you want to be the person who is really doing all the possible things they can do, hey, you can learn this stuff. But I also want to say, just the understanding, it's really valuable to understand how interviewers are evaluating you. There are questions that you can get that, so take an example of topological sort, which we actually have as like a tier 1 topic. Like, even when that comes up, it's not unusual, but it's not as common as, say, just another topic about graphs. But when it comes up, also understand that you're being compared to other people, and so it's not necessarily like, oh no, you didn't study this question, this type of question, so now you're totally screwed. Like, you're being compared to other people too, and if an interviewer was stupid enough to ask about, say, Dijkstra's algorithm, you might fail if you didn't know it, and also so would everybody else they were interviewing. In which case, maybe sometimes what they're looking for is not actually knowledge of that, but they're actually looking at something else. That comes up a lot with a lot of the math topics, is that knowing the math, some of the math helps you, but not knowing it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't struggle through it, because sometimes what they're looking for is not actually your knowledge, but your problem solving skills there. Of course, interviewers who are doing that also often kind of suck at interviewing, so you never really know.
All right, let's see if we can do 2 more. And then for the people who we don't get to, we can follow up on Taro, or you have the LinkedIn of all the co-authors, so feel free to reach out. But Tom and Sharia, let's try and do those last 2. Tom, go ahead.
All right, thank you so much for this useful information. I'm looking forward to buying the book. My question is regarding the trends with interview prep platforms. I see, you're releasing a book, but there are other services that are releasing a subscription or leveraging AI to help with prep. So I'm wondering where you are seeing the trends going and why you decided that a book is the best for helping prepare candidates in this era.
So, I think there's a lot of value and in using a lot of different resources. So there are a lot of people who still get a ton of value out of reading a book, because when you go online, there's so much information out there, and it's not about whether or not you have access to X piece of information. It's at some point about consolidating it. And there's a lot of people, I would argue, actually most people, who learn really well through a book. And what we've done with this is, it is actually a broader interactive thing. So we have a lot of tie-ins to, yes, all the content. We've made a choice from the beginning to say the book should be able to be used standalone. You should never have to go online to sort of get sufficient value from the book. However, there are things that actually work really well online. And so we've brought in a lot of tie-ins with interview replays, with actually creating an AI interviewer where you can actually sort of solve the problems with a AI interviewer. And so it's the book is standalone, but it's also ties into an online platform as well, which I think is a really amazing mixture of two great approaches.
I think the thing I'll add to it, and this is, I think, tooting the horn of my co-authors, is there's a lot of stuff out there. These people are the best people to be learning from. I mean, Gayle is an expert in this space. Mike is on Interviewing.io. We've had thousands of interviewers, and we have a pretty robust system that surfaces the best ones based on candidate feedback and how well calibrated they are. Mike is consistently like in our top 5, I want to say, sometimes number 1. So it's very easy to make a course about technical interviews. I think it's very hard to do it well. And this has been a labor of love for us for over a year, probably close to 2 years at this point. So there's a difference, but of course there's other good stuff out there. I'd say the other differentiator of this book is that it really tries to teach you how to think. You can get lists of problems anywhere. We're not trying to be lead code. We're not trying to be something like that. We are trying to teach you how to think both about your job search and about how to solve difficult problems.
Yeah, and actually, I want to just raise Nil to the top.
And Nil as well, of course.
Yeah, yeah. Just, I mean, quite honestly, like I'm pretty good at this stuff, but Nil's better, and Nil's quiet on this call. You hear him maybe not chime in quite as much, but full transparency, like the book is everything it could be because Nil stepped up, and he is like amazing at sort of breaking down my long-winded explanations, which tend to make sense, but make them more concise so that you can actually get the job sometime this year rather than, in a few. So, yeah.
Okay, amazing. And then last but not least, Sharia, go ahead.
Talking about courses, would you guys be opposed to making a mini course on Taro? Maybe not the algorithm part, but like just the part on how to get the interview. And I feel like it would be a great opportunity to promote the book.
Raul, let's talk about that.
Yeah, I would love that. I mean, I'm amped up after this, after hearing about the expertise and like how much time and care went into this. I'd love that. So great idea, Sharia. And then let's talk about this offline. Okay, so we're at time. I want to make sure that you all are busy. The launch is tomorrow, so I'm gonna drop the LinkedIn profiles one more time for all the 4 co-authors, and then also I think I have the Amazon link there as well, so people can check it out. Thank you so much, all 4 of you, for taking part and being here for an hour. Are there any last words you want to share before we log off?
I'll add this, which is that I think there is this idea that if you do a great job preparing, you're going to know all the questions in advance, and I think that sets people up for failure, both psychologically as well as just in their actual interviews. And what's really important, and this is what we're doing in the book, is trying to teach you how to think. That what I want to tell people is embrace the challenge, embrace the struggle. You get a question that's tough, great. Use all your tools, do your best. And I know this sounds really cheesy, but like things being hard is sort of what the process is about. It's about how you solve hard problems. Be okay with getting a problem that's hard that you struggle through, because if it's hard and struggling through for you, if you've done your prep, it's probably hard and everybody is kind of struggling with it. That's not a bad thing. You don't actually want interviews where you just know all the answers in advance. Embrace that struggle. And one of the most important things is that you work through those challenges when they're hard. I know that's cheesy, but it's also like the core most important thing for a candidate to do is be okay with problems being hard and figuring out how to solve them on the fly.